In the quiet suburban sprawl of Greenfield Estates, the days were supposed to pass without conflict. White picket fences lined the sidewalks, children rode their bikes in lazy circles, and porch lights flicked on as the sun dipped behind rows of tidy two-story homes. But beneath the manicured lawns and freshly painted shutters, something darker was festering. It began, as many suburban feuds do, with the homeowners association. The HOA was the glue meant to keep order in the neighborhood. Rules for paint colors, rules for lawn height, rules even for the number of holiday decorations one could display. But in Greenfield Estates, those rules had a human face. That face belonged to Karen McConnell, the self-appointed queen of compliance, a woman who believed the handbook was scripture and that she alone was its enforcer. Karen had been HOA president for 3 consecutive terms, each year elected not because her neighbors admired her leadership, but because few had the energy to oppose her. She carried herself with a tight smile and sharper eyes, forever armed with a clipboard, a pen, and a certainty that she knew best. What others saw as community order, she saw as personal territory to defend. When Judge Marcus Hale moved into the neighborhood, he expected nothing more than peace. He was a man of quiet dignity, a seasoned jurist in his mid-50s, with a calm voice that carried the weight of decades on the bench. To him, Greenfield Estates was a sanctuary. He had chosen the neighborhood for its stillness, its promise of evenings spent on the porch with a book in hand, its nearness to his courthouse yet distance from its chaos. He believed, perhaps too optimistically, that his new neighbors would see him as just another resident, not a judge, not a man marked by the color of his skin in a predominantly white community. But Karen saw him differently. From the first day he unpacked his boxes, she watched him with suspicion. She noticed the guests who stopped by to welcome him, the family members who visited on weekends, the cars parked along the curb. Where others saw friendliness, Karen saw infractions. Her first complaint was about the color of his mailbox, off by a shade, she claimed, from the approved standard. Weeks later it was his lawn, which she said was trimmed a fraction too high. Then his porch light, which supposedly stayed on past HOA-approved hours. Marcus brushed it off at first. He had weathered storms in courtrooms far fiercer than one neighbor's grievances. But there was something unsettling about Karen's persistence. She didn't just file complaints. She hovered. She lingered at the edge of his property with her clipboard, snapping photographs, muttering under her breath. Neighbors noticed too, but few dared intervene. After all, Karen had long ago established herself as someone you didn't cross. The complaints piled up in Marcus's mailbox like a slow trickle of venom. Still, he held firm. His philosophy, both in life and in court, was that patience and dignity outlast fury. But Karen was not a woman easily outlasted. Each ignored complaint only seemed to stoke her determination. Her muttering grew louder, her letters sharper, her eyes colder. By early summer, her fixation was undeniable. Neighbors whispered about it at HOA meetings, their voices low, their glances nervous. They spoke of how Karen had taken an ordinary rulebook and turned it into a weapon, wielding it not against the whole neighborhood, but against one man in particular. What Marcus did not yet know, what no one knew, was how far Karen was willing to take it. Her complaints were only the opening moves of a game she played alone. A game not about rules but about control, about power, about her conviction that Marcus did not belong. And as the days grew longer and the summer heat pressed down, Karen's obsession inched closer to the unthinkable. Because for her, a letter in the mailbox was no longer enough. She was already imagining something more permanent, something that would erase Marcus not just from the neighborhood, but from its memory. What began as petty rule enforcement was about to erupt into a crime that would shock not only Greenfield Estates, but the entire county. A crime born not of rules, but of hate. And though Marcus could not yet see it, the firestorm was already coming. The first sparks of Karen's obsession had seemed almost harmless, the kind of petty grievances neighbors laugh about over coffee. But by midsummer, the laughter had stopped. The tension between her and Judge Marcus Hale was no longer a private annoyance but a spectacle that rippled through the entire subdivision. Residents of Greenfield Estates could feel it in the air, the way you feel static before a storm. They noticed Karen's pacing in front of Marcus's house, her arms crossed, her mouth tight with muttered words only she could hear. They noticed how she arrived at HOA meetings armed with stacks of photographs, each one showing Marcus's home from some new angle, her accusations framed as violations. They noticed, too, that she rarely targeted anyone else with the same intensity. But while the neighbors whispered, Marcus tried to live above it. His days were long, consumed by hearings, motions, and the endless tide of cases that crossed his bench. He had learned to keep calm in the face of chaos, to weigh arguments without letting emotion slip through. At home, he told himself things should be different. Home should be a place where he could breathe. Yet Karen's presence loomed over his sanctuary like a shadow that refused to recede. Her letters became relentless. Some accused him of improper flag placement, others of leaving his trash bins out too long, others still of guests overstaying their welcome. They were signed not just as HOA president, but often with underlined passages from the bylaws, as if Marcus were a lawbreaker in need of schooling. Sharon, his younger sister, noticed the toll it was taking. She stopped by often, bringing meals and conversation, her eyes lingering on the stack of envelopes piled on his kitchen counter. "This isn't normal," she told him more than once. "This is personal." Marcus would nod, but his silence carried the weight of someone unwilling to admit that patience had limits. By late July, Karen's fixation spilled beyond letters. She was no longer content with paper complaints. She wanted to make her disdain known aloud. Neighbors reported hearing her voice on summer evenings, carrying across the cul-de-sac. "He thinks he's better than us," she would snap to anyone within earshot. "He thinks the rules don't apply to him." One night, Marcus returned home from the courthouse just as the sun slipped below the horizon. He loosened his tie, his body weary from the day. As he stepped from his car, Karen's voice cut through the air. From her porch she glared, a glass of wine in one hand, her tone sharp with accusation. "You don't belong here," she shouted. Her words pierced the quiet like shards of glass. Marcus didn't respond. He had dealt with outbursts far harsher in courtrooms filled with angry defendants. But those outbursts hadn't been hurled across the street from the place he slept, the place where his memories lived. He walked inside, locked the door, and let the weight of the moment settle on him. From then on, her hostility grew bolder. One night, a rock struck his front door with a dull thud. On another, his security camera captured Karen lingering at the edge of his driveway past midnight, scribbling in a notebook as though cataloging his life. Her mutterings, once private, became public. "He doesn't belong here. Not now. Not ever." The neighborhood watched uneasily. Some shook their heads, some whispered about moving, some avoided eye contact altogether. At the next HOA meeting, the quiet murmurs finally spilled into confrontation. Karen, seated at the front with her papers spread wide, stood and declared that Greenfield Estates had a problem. She spoke of residents who ignored community standards, who hid behind their titles, as if immunity from rules could be bought with reputation. Everyone in the room knew who she meant, but before Marcus could respond, a neighbor rose from the crowd. Linda Garvey, a retired schoolteacher with silver hair and a steady voice, spoke. "Marcus has done more for this community than anyone here," she said firmly. "He shoveled snow in the winter, fixed my fence when it broke, and he's treated every one of us with kindness. That's more than I can say for some." A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Karen's face darkened, her voice cutting like a knife. "Good deeds don't erase violations. This community has standards. Standards he refuses to respect." The meeting adjourned in tense silence, but the damage was done. Neighbors had seen the depth of Karen's fixation, her determination to paint Marcus as an outsider no matter what. For some, it was the first moment they realized her leadership had curdled into something toxic. For Marcus, it was confirmation of what he already knew. Her battle wasn't about rules. It was about him. He confided later to his close friend Victor, a broad-shouldered man who had known him for decades. Victor's advice was sharp. "She won't stop. You need to be ready." So Marcus prepared. He installed cameras around the property, updated his locks, and kept every letter, every photo, every scrap of evidence. He wasn't preparing for peace anymore. He was preparing for escalation. And escalation was already on the horizon. Because for Karen, humiliation at an HOA meeting wasn't an ending. It was fuel. Each denial, each rebuttal, each show of resistance added to the fire burning inside her. And though the neighbors thought her anger was contained to words and paper, she was already imagining something far darker. The line between nuisance and danger was beginning to blur. And before long, the neighborhood would see what happened when that line was crossed. By the time August arrived, the hostility in Greenfield Estates was no longer subtle. Karen's obsession had evolved from letters and glares into something more volatile, something that unsettled even the neighbors who once tolerated her sharp tongue. Her fixation on Judge Marcus Hale had become the neighborhood's silent dread, a tension woven into every summer evening. The days stretched long and humid, the kind where cicadas hummed endlessly and the air itself felt restless. Yet beneath the warmth of the season, Karen's anger simmered. She had lost face at the last HOA meeting when her accusations were met with resistance, when neighbors dared to defend Marcus openly. To her, that humiliation demanded an answer. She could not allow her authority to be questioned. Not by him, not by anyone. Neighbors began noticing her pacing at odd hours, wine glass in hand, muttering to herself about rules and belonging. Some claimed they heard her near Marcus's property at midnight, whispering as though she were speaking to the house itself. Others swore they saw her car circling the block in the early morning hours, headlights cutting through the dark like watchful eyes. Marcus tried to keep his composure. He continued his work at the courthouse, continued his efforts to live quietly, continued to tell himself that patience would endure. But even he felt the pressure building, like storm clouds heavy with rain. Sharon urged him to act, to file a restraining order, to take legal measures. Victor told him plainly that Karen was slipping into something dangerous. Yet Marcus hesitated, not because he doubted them, but because he did not want his home to become another courtroom. But Karen had already decided. She was no longer interested in bylaws or fines or whispered threats. She wanted permanence. And in her mind, permanence meant fire. The night it happened began quietly. Thursday, late July. Marcus had stayed late at the courthouse, reviewing case files for an upcoming sentencing. When he finally returned home, the neighborhood was still. Porch lights glowed faintly across the cul-de-sac. A few houses had televisions flickering behind curtains, but most windows were dark. He loosened his tie, set his briefcase on the kitchen table, and poured himself a glass of water. Sharon had stopped by earlier, leaving leftovers in the fridge, and for a moment, life felt normal. He climbed the stairs, switched off the lamp in his study, and prepared for sleep. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that comes only after long days, the kind that feels earned. He drifted off, unaware that outside, the night carried more than stillness. Sometime after 2 a.m., the first sound came. A faint crackle, sharp and unnatural. Then the smell, thick, acrid, unmistakable. Marcus jolted awake, coughing, his lungs seizing on smoke that had already seeped into the second floor. His eyes stung as he stumbled into the hallway. Gray clouds curled upward along the staircase, carrying heat that grew fiercer with every second. The smoke alarm shrieked, piercing through the chaos. Marcus ducked low, his training and courtroom composure replaced by raw survival. He reached for his phone, dialed 911 with trembling hands, his voice hoarse as he gave his address. "Get out," the dispatcher urged. "Get out now." He grabbed his briefcase from the study, the only thing within reach that held his work, his notes, the fragments of his professional life, and pushed toward the front door. Flames licked up the walls, devouring photographs, bookshelves, furniture. Sparks snapped like gunfire as the fire roared to life, feeding hungrily on wood and memory alike. Marcus burst through the door into the night air, collapsing onto the lawn, his chest heaving, his bare feet pressed into the damp grass. Across the street, neighbors spilled from their homes, faces pale in the glow of flames. Linda Garvey screamed his name, rushing forward with her husband to steady him. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, red lights soon cutting across the darkness. Within minutes, fire trucks barreled down the street. Firefighters leapt into action, dragging hoses, shouting commands. Water clashed with fire in a violent hiss, steam rising into the humid night. The neighborhood, once so tidy and quiet, had become a scene of chaos. Hoses stretched across lawns, neighbors huddled on sidewalks, children clinging to parents, their eyes wide with fear. But for Marcus, the chaos blurred into one unbearable truth. His home was collapsing. The roof groaned under the weight of flames before caving in with a deafening crash. Glass shattered, beams split, walls fell inward. He clutched his briefcase to his chest, but everything else, the photographs of his late wife, the armchair worn from years of reading, the garden Sharon had helped him tend, was gone. Victor arrived not long after, rushing to Marcus's side. He wrapped an arm around his friend's shoulders, his voice steady despite the devastation. "You're alive," he said, but Marcus's eyes never left the burning skeleton of his home. His voice cracked, low and heavy. "She did this." Investigators worked until dawn, combing the ruins with flashlights, their boots crunching over ash. By daylight, the truth became undeniable. Traces of accelerant lined the fence. A melted gas can nozzle lay near the debris. Security cameras from Marcus's property and a neighbor's doorbell confirmed what he already knew. Karen's SUV circling the block just before the fire erupted. 2 days later, officers arrived at Karen's door. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering, phones raised to record. She was led away in handcuffs, her chin lifted, her expression defiant, as if she still believed herself untouchable. For the residents of Greenfield Estates, it was surreal. The woman who had once lectured them about mailbox colors was now accused of torching her neighbor's home to the ground. For Marcus, the devastation was both physical and personal. He had lost not just a house, but a sense of safety, a trust in the promise that home was sacred. Yet even in the ashes, he stood composed, his eyes steady, his voice firm. "Justice takes time," he told Victor quietly. "And justice has to be fair, even for her." But what he did not yet know, what none of them knew, was how strange and brutal fate would prove. Because the next time Marcus Hale walked into a courtroom, it would not be as a man grieving his loss. It would be as the judge presiding over the case of the woman who had tried to erase him. The fire had destroyed his house, but the courtroom would test something even deeper, whether justice could survive when the victim himself held the gavel. The days following the fire were a blur of ash, smoke, and disbelief. The charred frame of Marcus Hale's home stood like a skeleton at the center of the cul-de-sac, a blackened reminder of what hatred could do when left unchecked. Neighbors walked by with cautious steps, their voices lowered to whispers, their eyes darting between the ruins and the house across the street, where Karen McConnell had lived for years. The evidence mounted quickly. Investigators confirmed accelerant at the scene, a gas can traced back to Karen's garage, and camera footage placing her SUV near Marcus's home just before the fire erupted. Within 72 hours of the blaze, she was booked into county jail, charged with felony arson, destruction of property, and hate crime enhancements. Yet what shocked the neighborhood wasn't just the fire. It was her reaction. Karen showed no remorse. When officers escorted her away in handcuffs, she didn't hang her head or cry. She stared straight ahead, chin lifted, as though defiance alone could shield her from the weight of her crime. Some neighbors gasped, others whispered unbelievable. But one thought lingered among them all. If she could do this to Marcus, what else was she capable of? For Marcus, the days stretched into a test of endurance. His house was gone, his belongings reduced to smoke and rubble. Sharon stayed close, cooking meals, bringing him clothes, reminding him he was still alive. Victor stopped by often, his presence a steady anchor. But nothing could erase the image of his home collapsing in flames, or the knowledge that it had been set deliberately by the very neighbor who once lectured him about porch lights. Still, Marcus remained composed. He had built his life on a belief in justice, calm, blind, and unwavering. Even now, as a victim, he clung to that principle. What he did not expect, however, was the cruel twist of fate awaiting him. On Monday morning, less than a week after the fire, Marcus walked into the courthouse. He had done so thousands of times before. His black robe draped neatly across his shoulders, his steps measured, his face unreadable. But this time was different. This time, the case before him was not about strangers, not about faceless defendants or nameless disputes. This time, it was about his own life. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, neighbors from Greenfield Estates sat in the gallery, and deputies stood at the ready along the walls. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind of tense energy that builds before a storm breaks. Everyone knew who the defendant was. Everyone knew who the judge was. And no one knew how the two would collide. All rise. The bailiff's voice thundered, cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. The heavy wooden doors swung open. Shackled at the wrists, clad in a county-issued jumpsuit, Karen McConnell shuffled forward between two deputies. Her eyes scanned the gallery, desperate for a familiar face, but found only the stares of neighbors who once tolerated her and now recoiled. She swallowed hard, her composure faltering for the first time. Then her gaze lifted to the bench, and she froze. There, seated tall in his black robe, his eyes steady but unsmiling, was Judge Marcus Hale, the very man whose house she had burned to the ground. The room fell silent, thick with shock. A ripple of whispers passed through the gallery. Some covered their mouths. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the reporters, pens poised, seemed stunned into stillness. Karen's knees buckled slightly. A deputy reached out to steady her. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. For the first time since her arrest, fear flickered across her face. Marcus's expression never changed. His eyes locked on hers, not with anger, but with the measured calm of a man who had seen hatred before, who had felt its sting and refused to let it consume him. Behind that calm, however, was a storm. He remembered the heat of the flames, the sound of beams cracking, the choking smoke filling his lungs. He remembered the moment he realized his home was gone. And now the woman responsible stood before him, waiting for judgment. Karen's attorney leaned close, whispering urgently, "Don't look at him. Eyes on me." But it was too late. The damage was done. The entire courtroom had witnessed the collision. The victim and the judge locked in a silent standoff, a moment so surreal it felt like a movie. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice deep and steady. "Be seated." The benches creaked as the crowd sat. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint scratch of reporters' pens. Karen's attorney rose. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty." The words hung in the air like smoke. A ripple of disbelief spread through the gallery. Not guilty. Despite the evidence, despite the cameras, despite the gas can found in her garage. She denied it all. Marcus's face remained composed, but inside, the denial stung. His home had been reduced to ashes, and here she sat, shackled but unbroken, refusing to admit what she had done. He glanced at her briefly, and for just a second, he caught something chilling. A flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, as though forcing him into this impossible position was victory enough. "Very well," Marcus said evenly, his gavel striking once. "The plea has been entered. We will proceed." The weight of his words pressed heavy on the room. For the first time, the gallery understood this was no ordinary case. This was a collision of personal loss, raw hatred, and the question of what justice really meant when the victim himself held the gavel. The fire had destroyed Marcus's home, but now the courtroom would test his very soul. And this trial was only just beginning. The trial of Karen McConnell began under a cloud of media frenzy. By the second day, the gallery was overflowing. Reporters from Raleigh and Charlotte filled the back rows. National outlets sent correspondents, and neighbors from Greenfield Estates lined up outside the courthouse just to secure a seat. The story was too surreal to ignore. The neighborhood HOA president accused of arson, standing trial before the very judge whose home she had burned. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence that carries both fascination and dread. Every movement, every word, every ruling was dissected. Was Judge Marcus Hale being fair? Was his composure genuine, or was grief coloring his judgment? Reporters whispered these questions constantly, their pens scratching furiously against notepads. From the bench, Marcus remained still, a portrait of control. Yet inside, each new piece of evidence cut like glass. The prosecution began with the fire marshal. He described accelerant poured along the fence line, flames moving fast and deliberate. He held up photographs of charred siding, melted window frames, beams collapsed in on themselves. Each image was displayed on large easels for the jury, black and white proof of what Marcus already knew. As the fire marshal spoke, Marcus's chest tightened. He could almost hear the crackle of flames again, could almost feel the smoke in his lungs. Still, his gavel remained steady, his tone calm as he guided the proceedings forward. Next came the detectives. They played the footage from Marcus's own security cameras, showing Karen's SUV circling the block at 2 a.m., headlights glinting against the dark. A second clip from a neighbor's doorbell camera confirmed the license plate. The courtroom murmured, the evidence undeniable. Karen sat rigid at the defense table, her lips pressed thin. Scribbling furiously on a notepad, she slid to her attorney. Her lawyer, Gerald Hinton, tried to poke holes. Could the cameras have been tampered with? Could someone else have driven the SUV? His questions rang hollow, the jury's faces unconvinced. The evidence was stacking against her, brick by brick, until the case seemed less a question of guilt and more a test of how much denial could withstand. Then came the neighbors. Linda Garvey took the stand first. She spoke with a trembling voice at first, her hands clutching the rail, but her resolve strengthened as she went on. She was obsessed, Linda said, always circling his house, always muttering about him. I told my husband something bad was coming. I just never thought it would be this. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Karen shook her head sharply, whispering to her attorney, but the damage had been done. Linda's words carried the weight of truth from someone who had watched the obsession grow day by day. Victor Daniels testified next. His voice carried a mix of anger and sorrow. I've known Marcus for 30 years. I told him to watch his back, because I saw how she was going after him. But I never thought it would end in fire. Never. His eyes flicked toward Karen, his jaw tight, his words heavy with contempt. Karen's composure cracked only once, when prosecutors played the recording of Marcus's 911 call. His voice, raw and strained with smoke, filled the courtroom. There's fire, my house, my address. Please hurry. The sound of coughing, the edge of panic in his usually steady voice, echoed through the chamber. For a brief moment, Karen's face paled. She looked down at the table, her shoulders stiff. Sharon, seated in the front row, wept quietly. The images of the charred ruins, the photos of burned family albums, the armchair turned to ash. It all felt like losing their late wife and sister-in-law Janice all over again. Marcus glanced at her only once. His face still a mask of composure, but inside he felt the same ache. The defense tried to paint Karen as misunderstood, overwhelmed, unfairly vilified. Gerald argued she was a woman consumed by stress, caught in the crosshairs of community tension. But each attempt collapsed under the weight of evidence. The gas can found in her garage matched the accelerant at the scene. The footage showed her car circling the block. The neighbors testified about her hostility. And beneath it all, her own words, overheard again and again. He doesn't belong here. By the end of the second week, the case had become bigger than two neighbors. It was no longer just about fire or rules. It was about a community forced to confront what happens when power and prejudice collide. Reporters framed it as a cautionary tale. What happens when the authority of an HOA presidency, unchecked and twisted by obsession, becomes a weapon? Neighbors whispered their regrets. Why hadn't they spoken up sooner? Why hadn't they stopped her when the complaints became harassment, when the mutterings turned to threats? Through it all, Marcus presided with the same calm he had shown on his first day as a judge. But each ruling, each objection sustained or denied, carried a heavier burden. Was he being fair? Was he leaning too hard? Too soft? The scrutiny pressed in from all sides. And yet, he did not falter. As closing arguments approached, the tension thickened to the point of breaking. The prosecutor stood tall, gesturing toward the blackened photographs displayed on the easels. This was not about rules. This was about hate. Judge Hale lost his home, but he did not lose his life. And that is the only reason we stand here discussing arson instead of murder. The defense countered desperately, painting Karen as a scapegoat, but the jury's faces were hard. Their eyes locked on her with disbelief and anger. When the gavel struck to adjourn for deliberation, the room buzzed with unease. The gallery emptied slowly, reporters rushing to phones, neighbors lingering with quiet prayers. Sharon touched Marcus's arm on her way out, whispering, "Whatever happens, you stood tall." He gave her a faint nod, but his eyes remained fixed on the jury box, now empty, because he knew the verdict would not just decide Karen's fate. It would decide whether justice could hold steady even when the victim himself carried the gavel. The jury filed out to deliberate. Hours ticked by, and when they returned, the air in the courtroom felt as heavy as the night his house went up in flames. When the jury returned, the courtroom stood in silence. Their faces were solemn, their steps measured as they filed back into the box. Every eye in the gallery followed them, every breath held. The bailiff called for order, though none was needed. The weight of the moment was heavy enough to still the room. Marcus sat tall at the bench, hands clasped tightly in front of him. Behind his calm exterior, his pulse beat heavy, each thud echoing with the memory of smoke in his lungs, of flames clawing at the walls of his home. This was the moment, not just for him but for the neighborhood, for the community, for anyone who had ever wondered how far hate could travel if left unchallenged. The foreperson rose, paper in hand. Her voice was steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Karen McConnell, guilty of felony arson, guilty of destruction of property, guilty of aggravated harassment with hate crime enhancement." The words struck like thunder. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sharon closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. Victor exhaled sharply, muttering under his breath. Linda Garvey reached for her husband's hand, whispering a prayer of thanks. At the defense table, Karen froze. Her lips moved soundlessly, whispering, "No, no." Her eyes darted frantically across the room, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. She shook her head, yanking her arm away when her attorney tried to steady her. For a moment, the woman who had ruled the neighborhood with an iron clipboard looked small, fragile, broken. Marcus did not flinch. His voice, calm but heavy, carried through the chamber. "The verdict has been read. Sentencing will follow." His gavel struck once, echoing finality. 2 weeks later, the courtroom filled again. Reporters crowded the aisles, cameras positioned outside for live coverage. The community of Greenfield Estates came in hushed groups, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the gallery. They weren't here for gossip anymore. They were here for closure. Karen stood before the bench, shackled at the wrists. Gone was the sharp blouse, the pressed skirt, the clipboard that had once made her feared. Now she was a weary figure in jail attire, eyes dull, posture sagging. But even in her diminished state, she carried the same defiance, her chin lifting as though she still believed the story wasn't over. The prosecutor spoke first. Her voice was firm, deliberate. "This was no accident, Your Honor. This was deliberate. It was not just an attack on one man's home, but on the entire community's sense of safety. Justice demands accountability." Karen's attorney argued for leniency, describing her as a woman under pressure, overwhelmed by responsibility, misunderstood by her neighbors. The words rang hollow. The gallery sat unmoved, their eyes fixed on her, their memories too raw to forgive. Then it was Marcus's turn. He removed his glasses, setting them gently on the bench. His voice was slow, steady, carrying the weight of both pain and principle. "You burned down my home," he said. "You destroyed years of memories. You endangered my life and the lives of my neighbors. And for what? Because you could not see me as your equal. Because you let hatred blind you to humanity." Karen stared at the floor, lips trembling. "I have spent my life believing in justice," Marcus continued. "I believe it should be blind, fair, and unwavering. Justice is not about vengeance. It is about truth. And the truth is simple: you chose hate. You chose violence. And now you must live with the consequences of those choices." The sentence came down hard. 22 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 15. The gavel struck once more, sealing her fate. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Microphones extended toward Marcus, their voices overlapping, demanding his reaction. He spoke briefly, his words steady but reflective. "I lost a house," he said. "But what we all risk losing is bigger than brick and wood. We risk losing the idea that neighbors look out for one another. Hate begins small, with petty complaints, sharp words, unchallenged hostility. If it isn't confronted, it grows. And if it grows unchecked, it consumes." That night, Marcus stood across the street from the ruins of his home. Reconstruction would take months, maybe years, but he wasn't thinking about walls or windows. He thought about the community that had nearly been torn apart, about the quiet faces of neighbors who now looked at him not with suspicion, but with gratitude. Sharon placed a hand on his shoulder. Victor stood beside him, silent but steady. "You did it," Sharon whispered. "You stayed true." Marcus nodded. His voice was soft but firm. "Justice isn't easy. But if it were, it wouldn't mean anything." Neighbors approached one by one. Some brought casseroles again, some offered handshakes, some simply said, "Thank you." They weren't thanking him as a judge, but as a man who had shown them what it meant to endure without breaking. Victor clapped him on the back. "You didn't just win a case, Dre. You showed people what courage looks like." Marcus's gaze lingered on the blackened lot, his voice barely above a whisper. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing not to let fear decide what happens next." As the night grew quiet, he whispered words he wished his late wife could hear. "We're still standing. And that's enough." The story of Karen McConnell spread far beyond Greenfield Estates. Newspapers carried it, court blogs dissected it, neighbors across the country debated it. But for those who lived through it, the lesson was clear. Obsession fueled by prejudice can destroy, but dignity, restraint, and justice can rebuild what hate tries to erase. And that is the reminder we all need. Hatred grows when good people look away. Don't look away. Stand up. Speak out. Protect what's right even when it costs you something. Because sometimes the cost of silence is everything.